Joining us on the line now from New York City, Edward Morse, the chief energy economist at Lehman Brothers. Thanks for joining us tonight. How are you, Edward?
Glad to be with you. I'm just fine.
Glad to have you with us. Let's start with the Energy Independence and Security Act. This recently passed legislation in the United States that the president signed just a few months ago. It has captured a great deal of interest up here, as you probably are well aware. Give us the highlights for a Canadian audience, as it were.
Well, I'm sure the Canadian audience is concerned about the impact on Canada, and frankly, the impact is de minimis. And it's not only because the act was certainly not intended to do any harm to Canadian suppliers, but because it's really a very narrowly construed act. It really means that the U.S. Department of Defense or other U.S. agencies that buy fuels that might be made out of Canadian-sourced material, can't do so if the Canadian-sourced material actually falls under the act. And I must say it is very unclear as to whether that material falls under the act, and the likelihood is that it doesn't. Because the act was really designed to target two sorts of investments. One are investments by American firms outside U.S. jurisdiction that were invested in outside U.S. jurisdiction in order to escape emissions quality laws or environmental laws in the U.S. And certainly, even with the American investors in the tar sands, they didn't move there in order to escape U.S. environmental law. They moved there, invested there, because that's where the material is.
Well, this is the key question here. People up here want to know whether or not this could, at some point down the road, prevent America from buying oil that comes out of the tar sands, or oil sands, as they like to call it.
Yeah, and the other part of it is really targeted at countries that are not doing anything about their own environment, and that certainly is not true about Canada. So I think on the second criteria alone, it is exceedingly unlikely that it would be applied to Canadian tar sands material. But in fact, it really does only apply to U.S. government buying. It doesn't apply to buying by any other entity in the United States. And in that respect, it would have de minimis impact even if Canadian production came under the jurisdiction of this law.
Well, I'm sure people in the West appreciate your interpretation of it, but having said that, here's what Canada's ambassador to the United States, Michael Wilson, had to say about this in a letter that he wrote to your Defense Secretary, Robert Gates, and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. He wrote, Canada would not want to see an expansive interpretation of Section 526 of this Act, which would then include commercially available fuel made in part from oil derived from Canadian oil sands. Canada is by far, he goes on to say, the largest as well as the safest and most secure source of U.S. energy imports of electricity, natural gas, uranium, and oil. And I guess the question I have for you emerging from that is, do you understand the difference between an expansive and a narrow interpretation of the section that Michael Wilson's referring to?
Sure, an expansive interpretation would say that Canadian government is not doing enough to curb emissions, and the likelihood of any U.S. government having an expansive interpretation of that, well, I can't say is zero, is as close to zero as I can imagine. And the fact that Canada is the predominant supplier of energy to the United States even reinforces that point.
Also in the letter, Ambassador Wilson said that Canada does not consider oil extracted from the oil sands in Alberta to be alternative fuel. What does he mean by that, do you think?
Well, the question of what is an alternative fuel is whether something is conventional or unconventional. At the margin, there's a big debate as to what is conventional and unconventional. Given the size of Canada's tar sand resources, in place at least, whether it's not commercially viable, the size of it alone has certainly driven people to argue that this is, at one point, might have been frontier material, at one point might have been alternative material, but it's gotten to the point where it's quite conventional under current technology. So I think that's probably what is meant by it. But of course, it's the job of Canada's representative in the United States to make sure that Canadian interests are pursued. So I can understand the zeal with which this is being pursued at this moment in time, even though as a quasi-objective outside observer, I would say it's really unlikely to be anything more than marginal.
Okay, let's go to, because when we here in Ontario, you think of the American-Canadian trading relationship as mostly cars. Some of us who live here forget that oil's a big deal in other parts of the country. So tell us, how important is Alberta and Canada to America's energy supply?
Well, it's really quite important, whether you look at it in terms of total energy supply or in terms of imports. We import as between petroleum products that are made out of refined products from raw material of crude oil or syncrude, and crude oil, a combination of material that amounts to more than 25% of our total imports. It is really a very large number, and dwarfs by a factor of 2 the next largest suppliers, which would be either Mexico or Saudi Arabia, depending on the given month. So it is really a very important source of energy. I've only mentioned oil. I haven't mentioned natural gas. In terms of natural gas, Canada was, of course, until very, very recently, responsible for 100% of U.S. imports of natural gas. Now that we have a marginal amount of liquefied natural gas coming into 4 terminals, that percentage has gone down to 90%. But it is an overwhelming amount of imported natural gas as well.
And can you tell us whether you believe this new legislation in your country, the Energy Independence and Security Act, does it have the possibility to affect the price of oil?
No, there are a lot more things that have the potential to impact the price of oil. At the moment, for example, the lack of pipelines from Canada, from Alberta in particular, to waterborne ports, particularly on the West Coast, but also on the Gulf Coast, have meant that virtually all of the Canadian oil exports to the U.S. go to the mid-continent of the United States. It's locked in this internal area of the United States. And as a result, the price of oil that one gets at the consumer level tends to be depressed. It's lower than, in many cases, lower than world market value. And when Canadian supplies eventually get to be equalized at a waterborne level, either through pipelines like the Keystone Line to the Pacific, or pipelines from the mid-continent of the U.S. to the Gulf Coast of the U.S. to fuel Gulf Coast refineries. Until that happens, that oil is sold at a discount, and that's far more of a penalty on the price of Canadian exports than anything that could come from this legislation of last December.
Okay, if not so much the price, how about the supply of oil? Could the legislation affect that?
Almost unlikely. The major buyers of this oil have a limited choice of where they're buying the oil from. The Canadian supplies are logistically closer. They're therefore much less expensive than imported material, which is the alternative. The alternative is not material from the lower 48 states of the United States. It's really waterborne material imported into the U.S. Gulf Coast and shipped into the mid-continent. And those consumers, those buyers, who have an incredible amount of political power as well as purchasing power, would not want to see a loss of that supply.
Okay. We know, of course, that Republicans have been in charge of the White House for the last 7 years. This is, of course, an election year in your country, and I wonder whether, if the White House changes hands and a Democrat wins, would you anticipate any change in the energy relationship between Canada and the United States?
No, I wouldn't, even though both of the main Democratic candidates have been taking steps that are, to put it mildly, a little anti-NAFTA. When it comes to the U.S.-Canadian relationship, I don't think that necessarily applies. I think it applies to the expansion of NAFTA to other free trade arrangements in the hemisphere. It applies to jobs lost in the mid-continent that have, at this stage at least, only a marginal a residual impact of the U.S.-Canadian trade relationship. So on the energy side, I think we're moving in the U.S. to a consensus. The consensus is to find ways to reduce the appetite in the U.S. for gasoline. That may be a boon to the motor industry, therefore a boon to the Canadian part of the North American motor industry as we gear up to create more efficient motor vehicles and impose more restrictive fuel efficiency standards on all vehicles sold in the country. I think the push that we have seen toward alternative fuels, which does, by the way, in this respect, incorporate tar sand syncrude, and also includes biofuels, as you know, includes fuels coming from coal to liquids technologies and gas to liquids technologies. All of these things should benefit the U.S.-Canadian trade relationship rather than to pose more obstacles to it.
Edward, we've been having, as you know, a big debate in this country as to whether or not we're doing enough to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and obviously there's lots of opinion on both sides on that. Do you, in your view, is this country doing enough to reduce its GHG emissions, particularly as it relates to the oil sands developments in Alberta?
Well, I think there's been the same kind of tension inside the Canadian political community as there has been in the U.S. political community. I think the citizens of both of our countries look to ways to improve the quality of the environment in which we live and make sure that we're not exacerbating the greenhouse gas situation. And yeah, to be sure, at an early stage of development, the development of the tar sands has been at variance with the principles of Kyoto, but this also has been a challenge, and new technologies that are being devised that reduce the use of natural gas as a feedstock, ones that use residue from part of the Syncrude process itself as a fuel supply, are movements in the right direction. I think this is part of a healthy debate that's taking place in terms of the balance between the environment and in relatively inexpensive energy. We're having a very similar debate in the U.S., by the way, on the use of corn as a feedstock for ethanol and what the environmental impact of that is. And those two debates, the one in Canada and the one in the U.S., will be interesting to watch over the next 5 years.
But is it your view that improvements in technology are at some point going to make this oil sands project not as violently unenvironmental as certainly critics of it today say it is?
Yeah, it's definitely, in my view, that both on the Canadian side of this with the tar sands and the U.S. side with respect to production of ethanol from grains, technology is where the win-win solution will be, and the technological solution is well within reach.
Let's just finish up last couple of minutes here on the commodity boom. You know, the Canadian Ministry of Finance and the central bank seem to be betting that global demand for commodities is going to continue to be robust throughout the rest of 2008, despite the status of your economy down there. I wonder, do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I actually don't agree with that assessment. I think the flight into commodities since really last September, although it's part of a longer-term process, but we've seen this really incredible movement to invest in commodities by a variety of different investors ever since the Fed started cutting rigorously and ever since the U.S. dollar started accelerating its depreciation against not just the Canadian dollar but a basket of currencies. I think we're seeing a little bit of the blossom of that coming off, a little bit of the bubble maybe evaporating. I think fundamentals are moving in a very different direction. I think the U.S. has not been decoupled from the global economy. We're seeing year-to-date a decline in U.S. demand for petroleum products of an order of magnitude of 500,000 barrels a day. That's a really large number. It's close to 1% of total global demand. We're seeing a slide in Chinese demand for petroleum products. That's partly related to the linkages between the Chinese economy and the U.S. economy. I think by the time we see the end of the year, we will see that the initial projections for demand, whether from banks like ourselves or the IEA or the OPEC Secretariat, will be halved because of the slowdown or the recession in the United States. And I think it'll be felt by commodity producers worldwide. It'll probably be felt in their currencies worldwide. And we are ourselves in our economic team projecting by year-end an appreciation of the U.S. dollar against a basket of other currencies, including those of commodity producers.
Okay. Edward Morse, good to talk to you again from New York City. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Pleasure to join you.